Global divides the North and the South. Objectives. At the end of this module, you are expected to, number one, understand the North and South divide. Number two, know the concept of the three world model. Number three, learn the relationship of the three worlds in the 21st century. The North and South divide. The North-South divide is a social, economic, and political categorization of countries. In their most basic form, the terms are regarded as a shorthand for distinguishing rich countries from poor countries. The North is taken to include the industrialized, high per capita income, national political economies of which the majority are located in the Northern Hemisphere. The South described those countries with high levels of poverty and comparatively low levels of industrialization, large numbers of which exist in the Southern Hemisphere. The North is comprised of all the first world countries and most second world countries. The South is comprised of the third world countries. Now, historically speaking, the origin of dividing countries into the North and South divide arose during the Cold War of the mid-20th century. During this time, countries were primarily categorized according to their alignment between the Russian East and the American West. The North, or the First World countries. The North have enough basic needs and have access to functioning education systems. All the members of the G10 came from the North, as well as the four permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. Now, G10, known as G11 as of today, comprises of these countries. We have Belgium, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, Sweden, Switzerland, United Kingdom, and the United States. And about 95% of the population in countries in the North have enough basic needs and have access to functioning education system. Countries comprising the North include United States, Canada, all countries in Western Europe, Australia, and New Zealand, as well as the developed countries in Asia such as Japan and South Korea. Now let's move on to the South, or the third world countries. An important characteristic of countries in the South is the relatively low GDP, or gross domestic product, and the high population. Another common characteristic of the countries in the South is the lack of basic amenities. The economies of most countries in the South rely on imports from the North and have low technological penetration. The countries making up the South are mainly drawn from Africa, South America, Asia, and with all African and South American countries being from the South. Now let's move on to the first, second world, and third worlds. First world, second world, third world countries are products of what we call the three world model. Now, people often use the term third world as shorthand for poor or developing nations. By contrast, wealthier countries such as the United States and the nations of Western Europe are described as being part of the first world. Now, the three worlds model of geopolitics first aroused in the mid-20th century as a way of mapping the various players in the Cold War. On the other hand, based on Mao Zedong's three worlds theory, the first world was composed of the so-called superpowers such as US and Soviet Union, The second world was composed of the lesser power countries, and the third world was composed of post-colonial emerging markets. Now, the so-called three worlds model was developed by a French demographer named Alfred Selby in 1952. Now, the three worlds model was used to rank the development of countries and their economies during the Cold War. Keep in mind that this is different from Mao Zedong's three worlds theory. Now, it was simplified by Alfred Selby by these categories: first world, those countries that are NATO or NATO aligned countries. stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Second world, the Soviet Union and their bloc of the other communist nations. Third world are the so-called non-aligned and neutral countries. For example, there are also some countries today that we might consider first world that aren't actually part of NATO. Furthermore, not all third world countries today are neutral. First world, so you can actually see on this map. So these are the countries who are considered part of the first world. Now, according to Sao in 2017, the first world concept was first fronted in the 20th century when the world was immersed in the Cold War and was a collective term for the countries which were under the capitalistic umbrella. First world countries were identified as countries which were allies of the United States, which were economically stable and shared common socio-political beliefs with the United States. And on this map, majority of those countries who belong to first world are capitalistic, or they have the capitalistic form of economy. Now, the second world, according to the definition, the majority of these countries either practice a socialistic system of government or a communist system of government. Now, these countries included all countries under the Soviet Union or Russia, China, North Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, and Laos. Now, the third world, or the term third world, was first penned in 1952 by Alfred Sauvy as well, a French economist and historian who defined third world countries as countries that were neither Western countries nor members of the Soviet Federation. These third world countries were predominantly found in the continents of South America, Africa, Oceania, and Asia. Now, let's take a look on the modern relations in first, second, and third world countries. Today, the powerful economies of the West are still sometimes described as first world, but the term second world has become largely obsolete following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Third world remains the most common of the original designations, but its meaning has changed from non-aligned and become more of a blanket term for the developing world. Now, we have the so-called, or what we call, the fourth world concept. Now, it was going to refer to ethnically or religiously defined populations living within or across national boundaries, nations without a sovereign state, and indigenous groups that are nomadic, uncontacted, or living outside of the global society. That is according to Sonyak in 2018. Now, the fourth world is also an outdated term used to describe the most underdeveloped, poverty-stricken, and marginalized regions of the world. Now, the three worlds in the 21st century. This has been especially the case in Western democracies, but the increase in subnational power has spread far and wide. The West no longer has a monopoly. The expansion has been fueled by the formation of a transnational elite who had been educated at the same universities, work in many of the same multinational corporation or NGOs or non-governmental organizations, and vacation at the same resorts. Moran wrote that the new model should instead analyze the world in the three non-state networks. These networks are composed of metropolitan regions that operate economically at a global, that is the first state, national, the second state, and regional, the third level or the third state. Now, let's take a look on the three non-state networks. First network. Now, this network of megacities is linked by transportation, heavy air traffic, heavy data flows, global exchanges versus media hubs, large universities, and multinational corporate headquarters. The second network, they are economically powerful but lack a critical mass of large corporations, research universities, media hubs, exchanges, bourses, etc. The second network citizens are tied to a national economy and compete and collaborate in a national economy. And the last kind of network is the third network. Third network metro areas are less populous and have fewer air travel options and have fewer linkages to global mega cities.